Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Harshmeet Singh and we are at chapter number 2 of class 11th Economics NCERT. I hope all of you watched the first chapter. In the first chapter, the theme was about the situation of India that the British left us in at the time of our independence. We discussed how at the time that India became independent, almost all the sectors of our economy were in ruins, be it agriculture, be it industries, be it the foreign trade, or be it the general demographic condition that Indians were in. The high growth rate or the high rate of birth, rather, very low literacy rate, high mortality, every single thing that you think can go wrong was going wrong at that point of time. We are now at chapter number 2. The second chapter talks to us about India from 1950 to 1990. Now, usually India's growth story after our independence is seen as India of before 1991 reforms and India after 1991 reforms. There's a wide scale acceptance about the fact that the 1991 LPG reforms that we will study in detail in the next chapter, liberalization, privatization, globalization, it changed India forever. That is why, rather than reading about continuous history of independent India, it is always advisable to read about India's history pre 1991 and then post 1991. And this is why this particular chapter talks about India's journey from 1950 to 1990. It talks about how India, soon after independence, planned to become an industrial and an agricultural powerhouse. How have we fared on that promise? What are the strategies that we deployed? Where is it that we stand today? All these things would be covered in this particular chapter. Now, as we discussed on the eve of our independence, when the British left us in an extremely bad condition economically and socially, we had many challenges. In those challenges, one of the big questions that the government of India or the Indian leaders had to take was which path to go ahead and take for our development. When I say which path, I primarily mean to say that there were two economic models that were being followed in most countries around the world at that time. It was a time of the Cold War, where one group was led by US that favored capitalism, and the other group led by USSR that favored socialism. India had to make a choice. Which way do we go? We discussed in chapter number 1 as well. Capitalism is an economic system where the private sector or the individuals have full freedom, have full liberty to undertake whatever kind of businesses that they would want. The onus of development, the onus of investment would be on their shoulders. In a socialist economy, on the other hand, it is the government that is the primary owner and controller of the resources. So it is the government's responsibility to push the development goals forward. In a country that is poor, does not have a lot of resources like India was at that point of time, capitalism is not a suitable system to go ahead with. Moreover, most of our first few leaders around our independence were actually socialist at heart. Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, most of these big leaders, even Patel, were in favor of socialism. India's relationship with USSR, in fact, was older than our independence. Even before our independence, multiple Indian leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru, had gone to USSR just to see how their economy works. Now, the USSR had a very unique system called the system of planning. Please understand, planning as a way forward or as an economic policy is not something that you see in every country. Planning is only a component of countries that have undertaken socialism as an economic approach. Why? See, plan or planning means that in the next 5 years, the government makes an assumption. Let's say in the next 5 years, we will be able to see XYZ growth in agriculture, we'll do this much investment in industry, etc. The government can only make these assumptions when they are the ones who are controlling the economy. If the private sector is controlling the economy, the government cannot make assumptions of what growth will we see. So planning is essentially a component of a socialist economy. USSR, used to have this planning approach, and from that we also took this up. The government of India set up the Planning Commission as an executive body. It doesn't exist now, it has been replaced by Niti Aayog. But the Planning Commission was first established in 1950 with the idea of preparing 5-year plans for the government of India, to make plans about what growth should we expect, what should be the target in the next 5 years, and then how should we go ahead to achieve those targets. The Planning Commission in later years turned out to be an extremely powerful body. They did not just make 5-year plans for the central government, but the state governments also had to create 5-year plans and then submit to the Planning Commission. That will then analyze that and see how much money should the center give to the states in order to achieve their 5-year plans. We will study about 5-year plans later on. It is an important topic in economics about how the Planning Commission went on, what were the key aspects of different 5-year plans in the country. If you look at the first few 5-year plans, it started with a lot of focus on industries, then it shifted its focus to agriculture, so on and so forth in the later years. This is what the Planning Commission was mainly mandated to do. First, have 5-year plans. That is, for the next 5 years, plan how the country would progress. For example, the plan would be something like in the next 5 years, we will see 10% growth in agriculture. We will see this much investment. We will see this level of employment or unemployment. Not just this, coordinate with different agencies, ministries, and states so that that plan and those objectives can be achieved. It was not just about making a plan on paper and then submitting it. It was also about how do we go ahead with the best approach to fulfill the objectives of this plan. Then the Planning Commission also was given the responsibility to undertake research and analysis to suggest government what kind of policies will be best suitable to achieve these 5-year plans and its objectives. Obviously, the final decision would be taken by the government to accept these decisions, but at least they can research, analyze, and they can suggest. Apart from that, making sure that the states and different sectors also get funds according to their own 5-year plan. As I told you, not just the central government, but the state governments also had to individually make their own 5-year plans. And in turn, they would submit them to the Finance Commission. Let's take an example. Let's say Uttar Pradesh made a 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan said that in the next 5 years, we would require to spend 1 lakh crore rupees. Out of that, 60,000 we can manage on our own, but they request 40,000 crore rupees of support from the central government. Now, this entire data would go to the Planning Commission. They would analyze the plan of UP. They would see if it is feasible, if there are some points that are wrong. On the basis of that, they would then suggest to the central government, they would recommend to the central government how much money to give to UP, either 40,000 or less or more. Now, please understand these recommendations that the Planning Commission would give to the government are not binding on the government, obviously. The government is free to decide how much money do they want to give, but increasingly we saw a trend that whatever the Planning Commission used to say was accepted by the government in most cases. This underlines the power, the influence, the impact that the Planning Commission had before it was replaced by the Niti Aayog. These 5-year plans had different goals depending upon where the country stood at that point of time. The governments greatly influenced the decision of the Planning Commission. When, for example, the governments wanted to focus on green revolution, the 5-year plans also focused on agriculture. When the initial government, such as the Nehru government, wanted to focus on industrialization, they also focused on industrialization. So it depended upon the priorities of the government that the goals of the 5-year plans kept on changing. As I said, they mainly wanted to make India a self-reliant country in all terms, self-reliant in terms of agriculture also, food, in terms of industry also, and in terms of talent as well, that we have enough people with required skills so that we are not dependent on others. to have a balanced growth. Again, not just growth, but balanced, sustainable growth. Why do we say that? In the past few years, there is a phrase that has become very commonly used in India, unfortunately, something called jobless growth. A few years ago, Raghuram Rajan, ex RBI governor, used this phrase of jobless growth. What he was referring to was the fact that India might still be growing, but a lot of people still do not have jobs. The growth that we are seeing is coming from few individuals. Like if there are 100 people in the room, one of them is earning 1 crore rupees. All of a sudden, you might say, oh, on an average, everyone is earning 1 lakh rupees. Everyone can be very rich. But no, 99 people are not earning anything. Only one person is earning 1 crore. So the average bumps up because of one person. That is what Raghuram Rajan is saying, that the growth numbers bump up because of few individuals. While overall the situation is not that great, we are in a situation of jobless growth. So that is why it's balanced growth that you require and not just growth. Growth that is sustainable, that is not coming at the cost of future generations or their resources. All that is the focus of the 5-year plan and what they wanted to do. Let's go through their objectives one by one. First objective of the 5-year plan was growth. Were we able to achieve that or not? How do we measure that? There are various ways in which a country measures its growth. Usually, the most accepted method around the world to measure a country's growth and to compare it with the other countries is something called the GDP, or the gross domestic product. You would have seen this in the news consistently. Our GDP growing at 6%, 7%, 8%, so on and so forth. GDP in simple terms is the market value of all the final goods and services produced within a country in one single year. So within the country, within India, whatever is being produced throughout the year, whatever final goods and services there are, again, final goods and services. When I say final goods and services means, for example, let's say a car is being sold at 5 lakh rupees. So you just add the 5 lakh. You don't add 5 lakh plus the cost of tire also, plus the cost of car also, car seats also, plus the cost of engine also. That will be doubling everything. So final product, final service, final product, you add all of that, that becomes the country's GDP. That is the most common method of measuring a growth of a country. At what rate are you growing? Growth in terms of agriculture, in terms of industry, in terms of services, all these three have been the focus of the 5-year plans. Unfortunately, specifically in terms of manufacturing, we have not been doing that great. Agriculture still finds services has always been the crowning jewel in India's growth history. At least after 1991, most of our GDP contribution has always come in from the services sector only, much above 50%. This is where India has been struggling with manufacturing. See, usually, if you look at countries around the world, if you look at the development and the journey that the developing countries take, the usual journey is when the country is poor, most of their focus is on agriculture. That is the driver of their growth. After a few decades, when they get slightly stronger, then they transition from being an agricultural country to a manufacturing based country. They focus a lot on industries, manufacturing, they make a lot of stuff. And then they focus on services sector after a few decades. In India's history, unfortunately or fortunately, we have made a transition from agriculture to services, skipping the manufacturing part in between. The problem with that is that out of the three, manufacturing is the one that is the most labor intensive, that has the most potential to employ the people. So without manufacturing being at the center, a lot of people who could have been employed there have not been employed. This is where we have a problem. But the government anyways has been trying to focus on all these three sectors, and again some of them have given good results. This is what the government has been trying to do since our independence: improve our productive capital, spend a lot more on infrastructure, factories, education. Now, the problem that India has is we never have enough money for our expenditure. We will study this. There are many terms that we will study later, but just to introduce to a term here, there is something called fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit means overall when a country spends more than it is earning, which is a common feature of almost all the developing countries, including India. Every single year, whatever the government spends, the total expenditure, it is more than what the government earns. So, how does the government do that? Just like how you would do by taking a loan. So, governments over the years take huge amounts of loan from within the country, within the market, and outside external loans as well. Now, it's obviously not an ideal exercise to spend more than what you're earning. But as long as that money is being spent on things such as building infrastructure, building factories, in other words, it is called as capital expenditure or capex, then it is not a bad expenditure. If the country or the government is spending a lot more money in capital expenditure, like we have seen a lot of infrastructure like highways, bridges, roads, ports being built, it's not a bad investment, it's not a bad expenditure. This is what the government is focusing on. But still, our expense on healthcare, education, etc., needs to be much, much more in order to develop our human capital as compared to where we are. Government also is focusing on enhancing our services sector. As I said earlier, services sector has been the crown jewel of India's growth story. It contributes over half to India's GDP, and the government is focusing a lot on expanding it even more because within the services sector also most of the revenue etc comes in from IT and computer related services. There is a scope to expand that even more, and this is what the governments have been trying to focus on: banking, health, etc. Technological advancements which require a lot of money, so we are lagging here. India, for example, spends much lesser on research and development R&D than other countries. Just to give you a comparison, India spends about 0.7% of our GDP on R&D expenditure, research and development expenditure, which is very, very, very low. There are countries such as Israel and South Korea that spend over 4%, 4 to 5% of their GDP on R&D. China close to 3% is the spend on their R&D. That is huge number. That is why for technological advancement we still are lagging. Then the government also has been focusing on industrial development. In the first few years, especially before 1991, the focus was on public sector enterprise. Most of the investment, most of the big factories, industry were set up in the public sector. Now that seems to be changing. We have a lot more private sector now coming up. One other interesting thing that we saw in India's journey after our independence was a gradual introduction of modern techniques and modern policies in which the factories can flourish, agriculture can flourish as much as possible. This is where the governments have been focusing on modernization, improving efficiency. Let's take some examples. For example, if you look at how we have ensured technological modernization in agriculture or in industries. In terms of industry, a lot of heavy industry has been set up. See, India was lucky in the sense that the time that we became independent, a lot of advanced countries came to our help, especially in setting up these big factories and industries. Institutions such as IIT Kharagpur, BHEL, NTPC, ONGC, they have all been set up with the help of countries such as USSR, Germany, giving us a technological expertise. It would not have been possible otherwise. Now, they had their own ulterior motive. The reason why USSR helped us quite a lot in doing all these was that USSR wanted to make sure that India does not go into the US or the American camp. That India does not become a capitalist country, India becomes a socialist country. US was doing its own bit. In terms of agriculture, also, we did a lot of things, especially the Green Revolution. You know, amongst our prime ministers, the one prime minister that does not get the kind of credit that he deserves for a short tenure of about 19 months was Lal Bahadur Shastri. Short tenure, unfortunately, died at Tashkent, became India's prime minister after Nehru's death. Not just was he India's prime minister at the time of 1965 war, but he was the one who actually initiated the Green Revolution that flourished later on under Indira Gandhi. Green Revolution was a series of new initiatives introduced for our agriculture farm sector to increase India's production so that we are self-sufficient in food grain production. Just to give the context, when India became independent, we were not self-sufficient in terms of food grains. It was America that used to help us. Americans had a program called PL 480. PL 480 was Public Law 480. Under this law, the Americans used to send food grains to very poor countries, including India. Now, these are not very high quality food grains, leftovers, you can call them, but it was extremely important for countries such as India that were not self sufficient. It's interesting how it worked. For example, so when the food grains used to come to India, India did have to pay some money for that, pretty low. But then Americans did not take that money. So that money was reinvested in India only. That money was invested in building some infrastructure in India only. So it was more of, you can say, free or not free. That is how the PL 480 program worked. But it was not a great situation. No country would want to be dependent on some other country, even for their own food grains, to feed its own people. We were dependent on America. They also wanted us to join their group as compared to USSR. So it was a very difficult situation. That's why we had to take steps to undertake Green Revolution. Because of the Green Revolution, that situation has never occurred again. We have not had famines in India now, touch wood. These are the important components of Green Revolution. First, introducing high yielding variety of seeds. HYV means high yield variety. So special seeds were introduced to improve the productivity of food grains in India. Use of fertilizers, pesticides, many other irrigation facilities were introduced. There was an international agriculture scientist, Norman Borlaug, who was called to India. MS Swaminathan played an extremely important role here. MS Swaminathan, who recently got the Bharat Ratna also. These are the components of the Green Revolution. India never looked back, at least in terms of food grain production. We became self-sufficient after that. We were never dependent on any other country post that situation. It was not just about industry, it was not just about agriculture, it was also about doing the right thing for your own population. This is what the government of India did to improve our own society. First, government focused on gender equality. They made sure that all the laws in India that are discriminatory against women are gone. For example, the Hindu Code Bill was introduced. The government made sure that, for example, political rights, etc., are common irrespective of the gender. Multiple laws for women's rights were introduced time and time again. Now, even today, it won't be right to say that women have equal status to men, which is wrong because many of them are discriminated against at workplace, which is a fact. But the situation is consistently improving where more and more people are becoming a part of the formal workforce, which was not the case earlier. Many more people now go out and work, many more women go out to work, many more women are a part of the formal workforce. There are many laws that we have in India, for example, the Maternity Benefit Act that allows 26 weeks of paid leave to pregnant women. We also have laws under which the companies have to make creche facilities for their children. All this is done so that women also are not discriminated against and can work irrespective of their gender. The government improved the socio-economic status of people, for example, giving reservation, making sure that there's no discrimination. We have Article number 17 in the Indian Constitution amongst the fundamental rights that abolish untouchability. All that was done after independence so that it is actually a society that is egalitarian in nature rather than discriminating on the basis of identity. The government also introduced educational reforms. This is an ongoing process. These are not things that are achieved overnight. All these are processes that just go on. For example, if you ask the government, have you achieved equality today? There is no right answer. It's always a continuous process. We are achieving equality. we are working in that regard. You can always become better tomorrow than where you are today. No one is at a perfect state. This is not an endless journey. All these things are continuous initiatives of the government that have taken place since independence. Then the focus on self reliance. Have we been able to become self reliant? Partly yes, partly no. Yes, in terms of agriculture. In terms of agriculture, we are self reliant. We are a major agriculture exporting powerhouse. But in terms of capital goods, heavy machinery, etc., fuel, we still are nowhere close to self reliant. Not just this, now as more and more new technologies emerge, AI, semiconductor chips, rare earth elements, in these things, again, we are not self reliant by any stretch of imagination. We are still dependent on many countries. So it's again an ongoing journey, it's an ongoing process. It's desirable that you become self reliant because the idea is when you're not self reliant, you're dependent on the other countries and on their own policies and wishes. Like in the COVID-19 crisis, if you remember, one of the sectors that was impacted after COVID-19 was automobile sector. There was a large waiting, long waiting for cars and bikes, etc. Because a lot of semiconductor chips that were used in their making you would come from China, and China was shut down for a long time period. So the supply chains were all shut down. So imagine if you're dependent on China for all your important components of all your industries, you would not be able to work unless they are working. That is not really an ideal situation, and you have to be self-reliant. So this is where countries try to be self-reliant. In agriculture, we have been able to achieve that, but not others. This is what we have done. The government is consistently trying to ensure import subsidization, means try and see if most of the products can be made in India rather than importing them. It might come at a higher cost. For example, now you would see every single year or every few years, the defense ministry releases a list of items that the armed forces cannot buy from outside. They have to buy from within India itself to improve our self reliance. The government also has tried to diversify industrial base after our independence, making sure that the private sector also is involved, making sure that the private sector can invest money and they have good policies, their capital is safeguarded. The government also is trying to promote our own local industry by tariffs and quota. This is a hot topic these days, anyways. Ever since Donald Trump has again taken the White Office, or the White House, rather, the Oval Office, he has been talking a lot about imposing tariffs. It's a common trend that many countries have adopted. It's a very common thing to understand. See, when India, for example, signs a free trade agreement with any country, let's say with Australia, that means if the Australian products tomorrow are entering India, we will put either zero tax or very, very, very low tax. Now, protectionist measures are something that almost every country is or can be accused of taking these days as well. Not just Donald Trump and America, but there are many countries who try to ensure that their own market is safeguarded. The Indian example of agriculture is not the only one. Whenever a country signs a free trade agreement with another country, they make sure to exclude certain products, which they call as a negative list, so that they are excluded from the free trade agreement and they can be safeguarded. This is what we have to do, or every country does, in order to ensure self reliance in the long run. Have these policies been successful? As I said, in terms of agriculture, we can proudly say that yes, we have become self sufficient. Agriculture is one of those sectors where we are a major exporting country in the world, but in terms of other things, be it capital goods, technology, etc., we still have a long way to go before achieving that status of being self-reliant. It's a work in progress. The situation has become even better after 1991 reform, but at least till 1990, our self-reliance in other aspects was still very much a work in progress. The other aspect that the government has been focusing on after our independence is equity. Equity means equality, bringing people at par with each other, making sure that irrespective of their background, people are not discriminated against, be it on the basis of birth, social, educational status, so on and so forth. The idea of every government around the world is to ensure that we are able to balance different areas. That is, the government should have to ensure that the difference between the richest and the poorest is actually coming down. If you look at our constitution, the directive principles that are the government's responsibility to ensure, it says that the government should try and make sure that the difference between the rich and the poor, the concentration of wealth is reduced. However, that is not true in any country around the world. There are so many different reports that come out year on year that show us how the top 1% or the top 10% holds majority of the wealth in the entire country, while the lowest section, the majority of them are deprived of even the most basic amenities. This is what the governments have been focusing on, including the Indian government, to try and minimize the gap in income and asset, to try and ensure at least that the essentials are provided for everyone. So this is where over the years many initiatives and schemes have been introduced by the government. Scheme for food, the National Food Security Program that we still have. There are many schemes of shelter, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, education schemes such as Right to Education, healthcare schemes such as the Ayushman Bharat scheme. All these are schemes introduced by the government so that these most basic amenities should not be something that people are not able to afford, irrespective of your economic status, irrespective of your social status, where you are born, so on and so forth. You should be able to afford all these things. You should not be deprived of these just because of your economic status. These are the things that the governments have done, Indian government specifically, to achieve equity. Focus on special schemes for marginalized section, backward communities. There are so many of them. Schemes especially for the welfare of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, especially for the welfare of people who are discriminated against in the past. There are schemes for skill development of minorities, of women, so that they are empowered enough to search and look for new jobs, which can empower them in turn and empower their next generation as well. Government's food subsidy program is well known, so much so that right now, if you look at the government of India's subsidy bill, the largest component of the government of India's subsidy bill right now is a food subsidy. Ever since we have the National Food Security Program, under which rice is given at 3 rupees per kg, wheat is given at 2 rupees per kg, and coarse grains are given at 1 rupees per kg. Ever since that has happened, we have a situation where food subsidy bill far supersedes any other subsidy bill of the government. The next one in line is the agriculture subsidy, or rather fertilizer subsidy, agriculture subsidy, whatever you want to call it. The government, after independence, also introduced multiple land reforms. Land reforms was one of the first things that the government of independent India introduced, especially to reform the agriculture sector. Most of them, for example, included abolition of zamindari. So the zamindars, that is the intermediates who were given the ownership of the land, that was removed. We also had the tenancy reforms, that is the tenants who used to work on that land for many decades, they were given certain rights. And most importantly, we introduced land ceiling laws as well. We will discuss about land ceiling as we go on. The simple idea of land ceiling is there is a maximum limit of land that an individual can own. If you own land beyond that, the government shall take it away and redistribute it to those who do not have any ownership of land. There was also reservation policy that the government has introduced from time to time. We still have considerable amount of reservation. Now, you may be against reservation or you may be in support of reservation, depending on how you view this topic. But there's no doubt over the fact that the intention of reservation was to bring in equity, was to make sure that we have more representation from diverse sections of the society when it comes to education institutions or jobs, including government jobs as well. All these are initiatives taken by the government after 1950, after our constitution came into being, till 1990 specifically. But to say that these fruits of development, or to say that all these initiatives have been focused equally in all parts of the country, would be an incorrect statement. If you compare rural and the urban areas, you would see in the urban areas, the government has been able to make much more development. The government has been able to build much better infrastructure in urban areas. It is in urban areas that the quality of life is much above as compared to the rural areas. The rural areas are still suffering from lack of basic amenities. You see, whenever, for example, anyone has a life threatening disease in the rural areas, the first reaction is to run to urban areas and see if we can find a place in a good hospital, because the rural areas lack those basic amenities, lack those basic necessities of life. Look at the education sector, look at any other kind of facilities. There are limited resources available, and there's much more social inequality. The cases of discrimination on the basis of caste, the cases of untouchability, are mostly seen in the rural areas rather than in the urban areas. And this is where the fruits of development have not been equal, and the government policies and its effects have not been equal in these two parts of the country. In terms of the urban areas, you see much more cultural diversity, because people from all parts of the country come to the urban areas in search of job. For example, look at Delhi or Mumbai. You will be able to find people from all parts of the country in these cities, because people have come in from these areas to find good jobs, to have a better life. So they automatically would have much more cultural diversity as compared to other parts. There are much more economic opportunities, there are many more jobs available, and there's obviously overcrowded facilities. Because as I said earlier, the problem in India is that if you look at how many cities can give you a good job, good life, good amenities, there's hardly a list of 10 cities that you can make. And when such a huge population is concentrated and is aspiring to be in these 10 cities, it would obviously result in them being overcrowded and not being able to give you the kind of facilities that you deserve to have a good life. There's also a challenge of balancing equity with growth. Means, while equity means that you have to make sure that the fruits of development are given to each and everyone, if not equally, but lump sum in a fair manner. On the other hand, growth would mean that the government should just push the growth of the entire country rather than focusing on certain groups. This is where it gets slightly debatable. I'll give you an example. Take the example of Bhutan. Most countries around the world are facing a dilemma right now, whether they should focus all the energy on development or whether they should focus all the energy on sustainability, fighting against climate change, etc. Bhutan is one of those countries that has taken a call that we are not running after development. As long as we have all the basic amenities that are given to us, we are happy living in a sustainable manner. For example, a few years ago, there was an agreement that was in the talks called BBIN. It was a transport agreement between Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. Basically, trucks and transportation, etc., from one country would be able to enter the other country without any restrictions. Although it was signed by Bhutan initially, Bhutan later on opted out of it. Why? They said we don't want unwanted trucks to enter into our country. They said that we know it will help our GDP, but we don't care. We would like to safeguard our environment. This is not something that you see most of the countries do, because in this balancing job between growth and equity, you usually go towards growth. When countries focus only on growth, that means it benefits the richer section much more. Because, for example, the best way or the easiest way for the government to bring in growth in the country right now is to help the industrialists, to help these big rich businessmen make policies that they want, allow them a free hand, allow them to expand their businesses. That would bring growth. But would it bring equity? No. It would keep on increasing the difference between the rich and the poor. So when the government wants to ensure that I have equality, when the government wants to ensure that we have growth, there has to be a balance between the two. And this is where the government has a crucial role to play in how are they able to maintain the balance. Let's look at sector-wise growth now from 1950 to 1990. As we discussed, this chapter mainly takes us before LPG reforms of 1991. It takes us till 1990 to show us what the situation was. Starting with the land reforms, because a lot of things were done in the agriculture sector. The land reform thing. As I said, if you look at the land reform, it was a very interesting idea. Before the British left India, there was one very interesting thing that harmed India considerably. Just before they left us, what they did was they distributed huge pieces of land to people who were close to the British. So people who were the supporters of British, people who used to help them in making policies, people who were servants of the British, they were given humongous pieces of land. And when I say huge, means 500 acres of land given to them, coal mine was given to someone. There were instances of single individuals owning entire villages. Obviously, the result would be that a lot of people would not own any land because that is how the distribution works. This is where the government introduced something called the land ceiling. Land ceiling meant, sorry, land ceiling meant that there is a limit on how much land can you own. Now, what was that limit? It was different for different states depending on how much land you have. For example, let's say in Punjab, the land ceiling could be, let's say, 40 acres. Let's say in some other part, let's say UP, would say I have 20 acres of land ceiling. So, how much land can an individual own? That was fixed by the government. The maximum limit was fixed by the government. Now, see, when the government says, I will take away your excess land, no one will be happy to give away their land to the government, right? It's your own hard earned property. Why would you want to give it away? What happened here was, just like in other things, when the government said, we'll take away your land, people were smart. They started transferring land to someone else's name. Let's say husbands would transfer the land to their wife, would transfer land to their children, so on and so forth. So the government had to be smart. The government said, okay, we'll put a limit on the entire family. But this was something that the government of India started to do. This even led to many, many, many Supreme Court cases. In Indian polity, for example, you read about the Golaknath case. Remember? The Golaknath case of 1967 was about this land property where the Golaknath brothers were very rich landlords in Punjab. Their land was acquired because they held over 40 acres. They held about 500 acres of land. Government said you can keep 40 acres, remaining we will take away. So these land reforms were introduced by the government. They met with a lot of opposition from those who owned land. There were multiple court cases, but the government still went on. Ownership rights were given, as I said, to tillers, to those who used to manage the land, who used to who used to work on the land. They were given ownership right. They were given the confidence that you are the owners of the land. If you want, you can invest money to upgrade that technology. And land concentration was reduced. That led to promotion of social justice. It was a part of directive principle of the state policy. The government should stop concentration of wealth in the hands of few individuals. It was a part of that the government introduced these reforms that ensured social justice in the long run. Apart from this, land ceiling example that I gave you, abolition of intermediaries took place. About 20 crore tenants came in direct touch with the government rather than communicating to the government through landlords or zamindars. Remember the zamindari system that we talked about in the first chapter, where the zamindars would collect and extract as much revenue as possible from the farmers and then keep a part of it and then submit to the government. That intermediate system of zamindari was removed. A lot of tenants directly came in touch with the government to submit their revenue so that they could also take advantage of the government schemes in the long run. Tenancy reforms were introduced. Successful states such as Kerala, West Bengal, they were the ones who introduced the reforms in the best manner. See, it is a problem even today whenever a government introduces a certain scheme, its impact will never be uniform, the same across the country. It will never be the case. Doesn't matter which policy you introduce, it will all have a different kind of an impact across the entire world depending upon how exactly comfortable the state is or how active the state government is. Do they really want to implement these reforms or not? The implementation will never ever be the same across the entire country. It will all be different depending upon what is the current government, what is the policy of the current government in the state. And this was a situation here as well. Certain states were happy to take these or make these reforms, but the other states still lagged a long, long way behind. Apart from the ownership, etc., the other important land reform, especially in terms of agriculture, was the Green Revolution. We did talk about that earlier as well. The Green Revolution, initiated at the time of Lal Bahadur Shastri, then taken up at the time of Indira Gandhi, was one of the single biggest landmark movements in India's history. Because this is what transformed India from a country that was dependent on, let's say, America for food grain production to becoming a self sufficient country that never had to face a famine like situation again. Now, there are other aspects of Green Revolution. It's not that everything was hunky dory, there were some problematic things with Green Revolution as well. But it was mainly divided into two phases. The first phase of Green Revolution was from mid 60s to the mid 70s, focused on certain areas, especially in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, and the main focus was wheat production. In the second phase, from 1970s to 1980s, it was rice and technological advancements that was the focus, and spread to other parts as well. But even after that, even today, if you look at the areas where Green Revolution actually spread, actually made an impact, it was mostly restricted to these places only. For example, Green Revolution did not really touch southern part of India or western part of India or eastern part of India. It was mainly focused in the northern part, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, maybe some parts of Bihar as well. This is where most of the focus was when it comes to Green Revolution. These were certain impacts of Green Revolution that you would have seen. First, biggest impact of Green Revolution was the increase in the production of rice and wheat. So much so that right now India is the largest exporter of rice in the entire world. The Indian basmati rice is an extremely high demand around the entire world. It still is widely sought after. India also is self-sufficient in wheat. We have enough food grains, much more buffer stock than what we require. It was all because of Green Revolution. We were able to achieve food sufficiency. The PL 480 program that the Americans were running, that was, see, for any self-sufficient, self-respecting country, no self-respecting country would be happy to say, oh, our food grains come from US, we are dependent on them. No. You would never want to be in a situation where the other country controls whether you are able to eat or not. That is the most basic thing that you would want to be self-sufficient in. Also, since India made such a bold foreign policy decision to not align with US or USSR and rather launch the non-aligned movement, it was even more imperative that India becomes self-sufficient. Because if we are not self-sufficient, how can we in this situation be dependent on the American food products and American food grains? So Green Revolution played a key role in making our foreign policy decisions successful as well. In the absence of which, our decision to go with non-aligned movement could have backfired. It also led to reduction in food import. Reduction, see, we are not saying zero food import, because understand, you can't grow everything. The basic staple food grains, wheat and rice, we are good enough with that. But there are other things that you would have to import. Like even today, it's not just crude oil. We also import a lot of edible oil as well. So a lot of oil that is used, vegetable oil, etc., that is all imported. So dependence on food import reduced, did not become zero, can't become zero even today. We were also able to establish food grain stocks. As I said, the Food Corporation of India came into being, and they were given the responsibility of buying stock from the farmers, maintaining a buffer stock, and we have a huge amount of buffer stock right now in wheat and rice, so that the situation of famine that we had faced does not come back. So all these things have been the impacts of Green Revolution. Having said that, it's not that everything was great. There were many problems with green revolution as well, and there are questions asked on green revolution and its problems even today in the UPSC examination. First big problem, regional disparity. As I told you, it was mainly focused in some areas in Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP. These were the ones that were mostly impacted by green revolution. So places such as, let's say, Odisha, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, they were not really impacted by green revolution. All these new technologies of high yield variety of seeds, pesticides or new fertilizers, new irrigation techniques are mainly focused in these areas. Amongst these areas as well, it was not that there was an equal benefit for all the farmers. The big farmers that already had a lot of money to invest, the big farmers that could actually take or buy seeds in larger quantities, the big farmers who could invest in better irrigation, they were the ones who actually could take advantage. This advantage was not available for everyone. One other aspect of green revolution that we are still suffering from is the negative environmental consequences. Please understand this. Green revolution supposedly pushed farmers to use a lot more pesticides and a lot more fertilizers. That obviously has a negative impact on the environment. Usually we talk about NPK ratio in the soils. That is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. The ideal NPK ratio in the soil should be 4:2:1. In Indian soils, this is way off. This is close to 8:4:1. There is so much nitrogen in our soil because there is so much overuse of urea in most cases. Because urea is available to the farmers at a highly subsidized price. And when you get something cheaper, not free but cheaper, you tend to overuse it. That is pure human nature. And that is what has led to a lot of environmental damage. Not just this, add to that the problem of groundwater depletion. There are so many Indian states, if you look at Punjab, for example, where the drop in the level of groundwater is alarming to say the least. Because there has been so much extraction of groundwater to grow rice and wheats that it has led to a lot of these groundwater depletion, pushing a lot of the cities on the brink of actually water extinction, groundwater extinction, which is a very, very, very dangerous sign. It continues even today. Even today, the governments are trying extremely hard to push the farmers away from rice and sugarcane production and focus on millets and other crops that do not take up so much water. This also emerged or led to income inequality because the farmers who were able to take advantage of green revolution could able to make much more money as compared to the other farmers. So there was anyways income inequality between the big and the small farmers, rich and the poor farmers, that accentuated even further because there were only a few farmers who were able to take advantage of this situation as compared to the other farmers who were actually able to get this money. The other part, another big debate in our agriculture is the subsidy. As we discussed, the government of India has been consistently trying to bring down the subsidy bill, and we have been successful in doing that. If I give you some present context, in the present context, in FY21, financial year 21, our subsidy bill was about 3.1% of GDP, huge, which has now come down to 1.8% of GDP now in financial year 25, which is a positive sign. But you can't reduce or withdraw subsidy overnight. There has to be a very gradual process to it. Now, the subsidies were required mainly because when you want the farmers to invest in technology such as high yield variety of seeds, fertilizer, etc., not all the farmers, or rather most of the farmers, would not have the resources, would not have the means to invest in that. So the government has to act as a support at the background and say, okay, don't worry, we have your back, you go and invest. The problem is that in most of the cases, many of these subsidies have not been targeted well. Rich farmers, the farmers who had money could automatically invest, but the other farmers, not all of them could get the kind of advantage that they were hoping for. But the government still continues to give huge amounts of subsidies in different types. These are the various varieties of agriculture subsidy that are given. We have something called the input subsidy, means subsidy to buy stuff that is an input, an ingredient in your farming. For example, seeds, fertilizer, pesticide. So Indian government, for example, gives a huge amount of subsidy on urea, on fertilizers, etc., at much below the market price. There are credit subsidies given. For example, when a farmer takes a loan from the bank, please understand, government never gives out a loan. Government may announce many schemes regarding loan and you might get confused. Please remember, government never gives a loan. Banks give the loan. Government then tells the bank that, okay, I will act as a guarantor, meaning that if the farmer is not able to return the loan, then I will give you the money. Or in other cases, the government gives credit subsidy scheme on interest, means it is also called as interest subvention scheme. Interest subvention means, let's say you took a loan from the bank, farmer took a loan from the bank at 8% rate of interest. The government will say you don't have to give 8% interest, you only give 4% interest, remaining 4% interest the government will pay. That is called credit subsidy. This is also a kind of subsidy government gives. Insurance subsidies, the government runs insurance schemes, PM Fasal Bima Yojana, under which again government gives input in the form of money being given in the form of insurance premium the government gives away. Price support scheme, the government has a minimum support price, MSP program. All of you would have read about this. The government of India announces MSP for 23 crops every year. 23 crops, and the MSP simply means the government assures that if, let's say, you have cultivated rice, you try and sell it in the market. Government says the MSP for rice, for example, is 40 rupees per kg. Just a random example. Government says if you are able to sell it at over 40 rupees per kg, great, sell it. Otherwise, come to me, I will buy it at least 40 rupees per kg. So there is a minimum slab. The government said that at least this much amount of this much rate I will offer you. If you can get over that, great, you can sell it at other places as well. Government also invest a lot of infrastructure, making of physical mandis, food chains, these food supply chains, etc., cold containers, cold storage containers. All of these are ways in which the government spends money, which is overall a part of what you call as agricultural subsidy. Subsidies are criticized, rightly so, in various ways. Mainly criticized because they help specific kind of farmers, big farmers, not all of them. It's also a huge financial burden on the government. It's never good economics. For example, if a government goes to take loan from the IMF, their first demand is cut down your subsidy. We will not give you the loan because a lot of our money will just go into free subsidies and there's no point of giving money for that. So government of India is trying to reduce that. For example, even if you look at WTO, we'll read about that later. In the WTO also, there's such a big debate about agriculture subsidy. Because the problem with agriculture subsidy is that it can distort trade. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say urea fertilizer, and let's take a random number. Let's say urea fertilizer pack is MRP is 1000 rupees per bag. So if you just go to market to buy urea fertilizer, you will have to spend 1000 rupees. Government says farmer can't spend this much. Government says farmer only has to pay 250 rupees. Remaining money government will give. So government will give 750 rupees. Farmer only has to give 250. So the commodity whose price is 1000 rupees per kg essentially comes down to 250 because the government has given the subsidy. Now what happens in this case, a lot of farmers, what they will do is they will buy this urea, not use it in their farm. They will sell it across the border. Let's say they will sell it to Nepal. They will sell it to someone in Nepal. They will basically unofficially, they will just try and illegally put it across the border, Nepal, Bangladesh, etc. Because in Nepal or Bangladesh, in their country, when the farmers are buying urea, they have to pay 1,000 rupees in the market. Their government is not giving subsidy. So that urea, in order for that to be cheaper, these farmers in Bangladesh and Nepal can buy it from Indian farmers, and they can still make money with that. So who is losing at the end of the day? It is the Indian government that is losing because of this huge subsidy bill that we have. So ideally, government has to cut down or reduce the subsidy, which the government has been working on. It can't be done randomly, but this is something the government has been working on in the long run. These are the challenges related to agriculture subsidy. As I said, first big challenge has always been regional disparity. You will never see subsidies or these kind of policies having the right or the same impact around the entire country. In states such as, let's say, Punjab, Haryana, it might impact positively or better. Rajasthan, it might not do the same. Similarly, when you actually make the farmers or make anyone dependent on subsidies, you are taking away the incentive to work harder and be able to afford itself. When the farmer knows I don't need to go extra mile and the government itself will government give the subsidy, why would I go and work the extra mile? I'm happy doing the bare minimum. So when you make people dependent on subsidy, when you make it a habit, a habitual exercise, it becomes a problem because government can't take it away, because it will not be taken well by the voters, by the farmers, and the government can't continue because it's a loss-making exercise. There are many corruption and leakages. Obviously, Rajiv Gandhi, when he was a prime minister, famously made that statement that when I send 1 rupees from Delhi to someone, only 15 paisa reaches them. Remaining 85 paisa is lost in between of corruption, leakages at different levels. There are environmental concerns as well, because again, when you give urea, for example, at a lower cost, you would not be able to restrict its usage. It is used much more frequently as compared to what it should be. It is leading to a lot of environmental concerns in the long run as well. These are some of the reforms that have been proposed. Phasing out agriculture subsidy, which the government is trying to do, making it more efficient. As I gave the example earlier, in the present context, the government has been able to reduce their subsidy bill considerably, and they're trying to bring it even lower. Food subsidy is by far the most or the biggest ticket item for the government, and then we have the fertilizer subsidy. Government is trying to reduce that as well. This is the growth. As you can see, over the past few years, allocation for agriculture sector funding, etc., research sector growth, 1.25 lakh crore rupees were allocated here for agriculture subsidy, and then decreased to 1.23, has been in similar ballpark. It has increased now, increased to 2024-25 to about 1.52 lakh crore. So that's a certain increase in agriculture sector. Most of the money that the government allocates to agriculture sector is for funding, it's for subsidy only. So not a good sign that the government has increased it here. But when the government thinks that there is a requirement that we need to expand agriculture further, we need to maybe invest in R&D, that is when you will see, hopefully, the subsidy will come down in the future. These are some of the other challenges that the agriculture sector faces. Still, humongous amount of our population depends on agriculture in some way or the other. There is not good enough transition to other places. See, I'm not saying it doesn't require any skill, but agriculture is something that is taken up by others, by people who do not have as many skills as possible to get other jobs. So transitioning to manufacturing and other jobs that require more skills has not been seen. So there is lack of transition, which is not a good thing. Ideally, the approach for any society would be that people who are engaged in agriculture should gain more skill and transition to formal services or industrial sector. That has not been the case here. There is also a problem of poverty, inequality. There is disparity in the rural areas, which the government has to focus on, because again, farmer is one generic word, but it's not that all the farmers are the same. Some farmers are extremely rich, have many resources, can invest huge amounts of money for new techniques, but a lot of other farmers are small and marginal, and they still require government support. For example, as you know, government runs something called the PM Kisan scheme right now. PM Kisan Samman scheme, under which 6,000 rupees per year are given to small and marginal farmers who have land of 2 hectares or less. So the problem is not with the big farmer, it's mostly with the small marginal farmer. Now let's talk about the industrial sector, the one sector where government of India has been extremely focused on even right now. But when India became independent at that point of time, there were mainly two schools of thought. You usually read about this in political science. What was the kind of plan that India opted for? Famously, there were two schools of thought. As I said, one was called the Gandhian model. That is Mahatma Gandhi's view of what would be best for India going forward. And then there was a Nehruvian model. Now, interestingly, although as we all know, Nehru was a disciple of Gandhi, but it's not that they were in agreement in every other thing. There were some things on which their views differed. And one such part of their discussion was about how India should go forward, what should be the plan of India after independence. Gandhi, for example, was of the view that we should focus on the villages, we should focus on cottage industry, rather than focusing on heavy machinery industries, our focus should be on agriculture and making everyone self sufficient in the rural areas. Gandhi famously said that India resides in the villages, in the rural areas, and unless we take care of that part of our population, our overall population will never be able to prosper. Now, it's not to say that Nehru did not want development of villages, but the way that Nehru wanted to approach this problem was top-down approach, meaning for Nehru, the focus should have been on industries. He wanted to invest a lot of money into heavy industries, support the big industrialists so that we could have a lot of jobs in manufacturing sector and we could have a trickle down effect. Since Gandhi never joined the government and unfortunately passed away very soon after our independence, it was Nehru's view that took priority over anyone else. And this is where our first few years of the government were spent. Nehru, on the inauguration of one of the dams, had famously said that dams are the temples of modern India. That was his view towards this heavy infrastructure that the country needed at that point of time. I'm telling you this because it underlines the fact that industrial sector was always at the forefront of the initial few governments of how they wanted India to prosper. Having said that, it's not that it gave a lot of positive results. In fact, even today, the governments have been struggling with increasing the contribution of industries in our overall GDP, and they have not been able to strike the balance that is required. We still have a lot of issues where we don't have enough jobs in manufacturing, we don't have enough skills, we don't have enough capital, there are a lot of problems of red tape. All these issues have sprung up. Now, in the industrial sector, there are two main aspects of it, the public sector and the private sector. The public sector mainly run by the government, private sector run by the private companies. Now, how is it that India started? Please understand around the world, and we discussed this earlier, so there are two main economic policies, capitalism and socialism. In capitalism, where the government takes a step back, it allows the private companies, the private individuals to run the businesses with a lot of liberty. In socialism, it is the government that mainly controls the means of production. Then there is the mixed approach, which is called as a mixed economy. If you look at the present context, in the present context, not just India, but most countries around the world have opted for a mixed economy approach, wherein the private and the public sector both coexist. And increasingly in India, as of today, the public sector, the government sector is stepping back, allowing more and more space to the private sector. However, at that point of time when India became independent, we did not have a lot of capital in the private hands. And thus, it was the government that had to come up and start investing huge amounts of money so that the country can see any kind of progress. So, the initial few years were focused on the government companies expanding their reach, trying to touch as many sectors as possible. Now, the first few policies or the first important policy in terms of industry in independent India was Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. This was the first official industrial policy document in independent India. What did this resolution talk about? It said that mainly industries are of three categories that would exist in India. First, they said would be exclusively state owned. So it would be owned, controlled by the government with no participation of the private sector. Even today, there are so many of these companies that are just owned by the government. Railways, defense. Now, again, this is in context of back then. In today's context, in defense, there are a lot of private sector companies that have come up. A lot of private sector production is now going on with companies such as Tata, Adani, Mahindra, all of them taking a part in the defense manufacturing. The second kind of companies, as per this policy resolution, would be the state and private collaborations, where both of them will work together, where the private sector will also bring in their capital, their expertise, their technology, and they will work together. You would be surprised to know that a lot of the companies that are the government companies right now, historically were actually private companies, which were taken over and nationalized by the government. Air India is one interesting example. It was started by the Tatas, then the government nationalized it, and now again it has gone back to Tatas. One other example that many people don't know of is the HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, that manufactures planes such as Tejas, the government entity, but it started as a private company. So the second kind of companies this policy talked about was state and private collaboration. And the third type of companies allowed in India would be the private sector ones, where the industries would not be, where those which are not covered in first two categories will come here. It would not have much state control. The state would give it a lot of liberty, but there would be certain regulations. The aim of the policy was that all these three could coexist, but it specifically said that India would go on in a socialist pattern. We were very, very, very clear about this. Now, please understand the word socialism was only added, the word socialism was only added in our preamble in 1976. But that doesn't mean that we were not a socialist country. We were always a socialist country since the time of our independence. We never thought of mentioning it explicitly in the preamble. It was mentioned much later on by 42nd Amendment 1976. But India was very clearly a socialist country, if you can see in these kind of policies. This is what the policy talked about. It talked about India having a mixed economy. Mixed economy can be of different proportions. Mixed economy can never be half public and half private. It just means coexistence of both. See, the government would never give such a free hand to private sector that okay, you can exist, no licenses required. Even in India's mixed economy approach back then, there was private sector that was allowed, but to a very lesser extent. Back then, to open up any private entity, you needed a lot of permissions, licenses, etc. Now that has come down drastically. Now you don't need so many licenses, you don't need so many restrictions in order to open up or launch these kind of things. The policy also talked about public sector dominance. Most of the core industries were under the government. Now compare that to today. In today's time, very, very few sectors in India are exclusively for the government alone. Like right now, even in space sector, you have so many private startups in cities such as Bangalore and Hyderabad that are building their own satellites. Even in defense, as I told you, there are so many private companies that have come up. There are very, very few sectors now where private sector is still not allowed. For example, nuclear energy, exploration of nuclear related minerals. Those are the ones where the government still does not allow private sector. But otherwise, apart from that, we have very much private sector participation in almost every sector as of today. But it was not the same back then, where the government would take control of most of the core sectors. The policy also talked about private sector growth. Government would try and encourage public or private investment, but it was not to be too very lucrative. See, if you already have money in your hand, you would always want to invest in those aspects of those programs which have a greater chance of giving you good returns. When you think there is an area where there is so much government intervention and the government would decide your future, you would not really want to take a chance and invest your capital there. So although the government on paper said private participation is encouraged and allowed, but there was very minimal private participation. There was also regional development. The government tried to promote balanced growth. The government tried to make sure that, for example, if government factories are being opened up, they should be spread to different parts of the country, not just focus on few parts. For example, if you look at first few developments that took place, headquarters of these big government companies were not all in big cities of Mumbai and Delhi, etc. The government tried to spread it as much as possible. Then government also tried to support small scale industries. This was again one of the things that you have to connect with what was happening at that point of time. See, nothing happens in isolation. Every government policy is connected to something else. In modern history or rather in post-independence history, you will read about bank nationalization of 1969. One of the most controversial decisions of Indira Gandhi government was bank nationalization of 1969. At that time, India had 20 private banks. The government announced that we will take over 14 of those banks. So 14 banks were told that you'll become government banks now. That led to a lot of hue and cry amongst these banks, these big industrialists that did not like it. There were multiple cases filed in the Supreme Court as well. The idea of the government said that banks don't give enough loan to small scale industry or agriculturists, farmers, etc. These private banks are only focused on big industries and only offer loans to them. So government said that the only way for us to correct this disbalance is take over the banks and then we will decide. And that is why we now have provisions such as priority sector lending, PSM norms that have come up that kind of push the banks towards giving loans to farmers, small scale industry, education loans have become much easier because of this. Otherwise, if the government would not regulate this, you would hardly see money flowing into, let's say, education loans or small scale industry, MSME, etc. This policy also talked about planned development, as we discussed earlier as well. India established a planning commission right after independence so that they could make a 5-year plan of what should be the aim going forward in the next 5 years. All these were components of India's industrial policy that first came up in 1956. Now, not to say that it was able to achieve all its goals, but at least it was a beginning, a statement from the government that the government is serious about industrial expansion going forward. The first government specifically focused a lot on public sector expansion. As much as government could do, they did invest in industries, infrastructure, dams, etc. There were many important industries that were set up at that point of time in steel, heavy machinery sector. There were companies such as ONGC, BHEL, Bharat Heavy Electrical Limited, NTPC. All these came up when the government wanted to focus on these. Now, as I said earlier as well, these would not have been possible without the help of some of the friendly countries to us. USSR, Germany did play an important role in helping us in setting up of these big industries. There was also focus on creation of state-owned enterprises, PSUs. Even today, it is such a big issue. Should the government be running the businesses or not? Should the government just sell it to the private sector? But initially, the government thought it is their responsibility so that the government can drive these policies in favor of Indians, in favor of the citizens, so that they could determine how many jobs would be given out, what would be the focus of different sectors, etc. There was also emphasis on planned development so that the government could plan ahead and we could have a target in our mind in the next few years. All these were keeping in mind the fact that the government wanted public sector, that is the sector owned and controlled by the government, to flourish so that the government could actually have the keys of India's development in their hand. Having said that, public sector had its own issues and they continue to have them even today. There are so many of these issues because of which, if given a choice today also, you ask any common man or random man a question about efficiency of government companies and private companies, mostly people will say private companies are far more efficient. Now, why is that the case? Think of it. If you have to post something today, send a small normal post and money is not a concern. If I give you the option to use private companies like DTDC, FedEx, etc., or use post office, most of the people would not opt for post office because be it a fact or not, but the perception in your mind is that the post office is inefficient and would not be able to do that job properly. It is because there are a lot of existing issues in the public sector without being denied. First, inefficient management. Most of these companies, the government companies, are run not by people who are experts of that field. For example, in the private sector, most of the big companies are run by people who have learned how to run big companies, who have done MBAs, who have run businesses all throughout their life. On the other hand, in case of government entities, most of them are run by bureaucrats. Now, bureaucrats have not been trained to handle companies, they have been trained to handle government policy. There is a big difference in that. Also, their job, their incentive may not be directly related to or bound to the performance of the company that they are. They have a fixed salary, irrespective of their performance, irrespective of the performance of the company that they are handling, their salary, etc., will remain the same. But in the private sector, your future, your performance, all of that is fixed and it is in line with the performance of the organization that you are handling. And this is where those are much, much more efficient, while the government organizations turn out to be pretty inefficient. There are also multiple bureaucratic delays that we are all aware of. Bureaucratic delays, it's because of multiple reasons. If you apply for, let's say, permission from the government or some licenses from the government, it will take a lot of time. It may be seen as a way for the government officer to demand right from you, or it may be seen as a government officer playing safe. They want to be sure, they want to verify every document double, 3 times or 4 times so that they can take a decision accordingly without getting into trouble. So there is a lack of risk-taking appetite because they are not concerned with whether the development is taking place at a fast pace or not. Their concern is that I don't want to get caught in it. I don't want to be held responsible if something wrong happens, so I might as well rather delay the decision. There are also concerns about corruption. I don't think this needs any explanation. When you look at some of the rankings that we have, Transparency International, for example, is an international NGO that comes up with corruption perception index. India does not perform very well. Not to say that private sector is devoid of corruption, but the public sector is well known for corruption, and that too starts at the very lowest level. The lowest rung of bureaucracy is often the one that comes in direct contact with the common people. And it has become a very common exercise, a very common kind of a phenomena where you are asked for bribe for very simple, small little things. Then there are obviously political considerations that are involved. This is where the problem becomes even worse. For example, if a ruling party or a politician of influence wants to win election from a specific constituency, they will try and make sure that whatever jobs they have should go to that constituency, whether it makes sense or not, whether the people of that area are skilled enough or not, whether it makes financial sense or not. But the decisions of the company in such cases will not be determined by business model, or will not be determined by business acumen. It will rather be determined by political considerations. What does the politician think? What will suit him or her best? This is where it becomes even worse. Because when you're competing with a private company, their decisions are much more analytical, much more objective, not considering who they will like it or not, with a few people like it or not. For example, why is it that there is a well-known perception that once you get a government job, you can never be removed? Well, there's a perception about government jobs that once you get them, you will never be removed unless you do a huge blunder. Why is that? And that is not false. But that proves the fact that when you get a government job, efficiency does not matter. The government will not throw you out. That is why a lot of government departments are overburdened, overcrowded, many more people than what is required to do the job. All that leads to inefficiencies. The government cannot remove people from the job because it will go against them when it comes to asking for votes from the people. So again, it is a political considerations that are kept in mind before taking such decisions. And that is why it is difficult for the government companies to compete with the private sector. Because when they take their decisions, those are much, much more objective. In the industrial policy, the government's focus was not just on the big heavy industry, but also on the small scale industry. Later on, we will read about the MSME sector of India, micro, small, medium enterprises. As per this year's economic survey, over 23 crore people in India are employed in the MSME sector. So it's by far the biggest employer of people in India. And that is why the government also for many years has been focusing on small scale industries, trying to help them out. Have they been successful? Not entirely. The idea has been to promote their growth, allow them to offer more employment, have certain reservation of certain products as well from small scale industry. For example, the government tries to encourage its own departments to buy products from small scale industry rather than bigger industries. The government also has been trying to offer concession like lower excise duties, lower taxes, etc. All that is being done so that there is a perception, at least, that the small scale industries are actually working well. Small scale industries are flourishing in the entire country. There have been some achievements in that regard. It's not that they have flourished as much as the government would have wanted, but there have been certain achievements. I told you at present, and the latest data says that over 23 crore people are deployed or employed in some way or the other by the MSME industry. The government has opened up many portals as well for the registration. The government has made it easier for them to get credits from the banks. The government also acts as a guarantor in many cases to the banks, offering or asking them to give loans to these companies. So, in that way, they have been able to empower small scale entrepreneurs. However, it is again much lower than the expectation of the government in the long run. The small scale industries face challenges of their own. These are some of those challenges. First one, technological backwardness. It all has to do with money. Using state of the art technology, using state of the art machinery requires a lot of investment money from your side. When you open a small scale industry, the reason why you are small is that you don't have enough money, you don't have enough investment to actually put in that much money or to put in that much capital. That means that you have technological backwardness, and that makes it even more difficult for you to compete with large scale industries. Imagine this: you have a small industry, you have a small, let's say, market, and you want to produce certain goods, but you don't have machine to do it by hand manually. Will you be able to compete against those companies that are doing the same thing by machine? No. This is where the problem actually starts. So technological backwardness means that your productivity or growth is not as much, and you will find it extremely difficult to eventually compete with the other companies in the same sector. There's a problem of low productivity. There is inefficiency. Low productivity means again for the same time period, for the same effort, you will not be able to produce the kind of products or the kind of output or services that other competitors would. And this is where the market will not be firm. There are also issues of inability to compete with large industry. Again, it's a subset of that. Not having enough capital, not having enough technology means you will eventually lag behind when it comes to competition, and the market does not consider whether you're a small company, so they will encourage you, nothing like that. Imagine this: you are a consumer, you go to the market to buy a certain product. Will you buy a certain product just because you want to encourage a small company? No. As an end consumer, you will only buy the products that you can afford, you like, has the best quality, simple. As a consumer, you are not concerned about whether I want to give push to these small companies. That is not your concern. That is why these companies stumble. Also, imported product competition. Again, this is a big problem that many developing countries have, especially from China. Over the years, China has mastered the art of manufacturing stuff at a much lower cost. It is partly because the Chinese government has offered a lot of subsidies. The Chinese government has offered a lot of incentive for their companies that has artificially reduced the prices of a lot of Chinese products. So the same mobile phone that you manufacture in India in 20,000 rupees, exactly the same can be manufactured in China without any difference in 10,000 rupees. So when the product comes to India, even if you put import taxes on that, that will still be 13, 14,000. So why would an Indian consumer then buy Indian company products? Again, the reason that you buy Chinese products is because they're much more affordable of a similar quantity, of a similar quality. For you, you want to preserve money in your pocket. Everything else is secondary. This is where the small companies find it extremely difficult to compete with imported products. And this is where we come to the other aspect of our policy. Since our independence, we have been focusing on something called import substitution. The idea is simple. Whatever we have to import, let's try and make this in India. Now, obviously, it can't be done for everything. Some minerals that we just don't have, we don't have an option but to import. We import 85% of our crude oil requirement. 85%. Because we have to. There is no other alternative available at all. But then products that can be manufactured in India, does it make sense for you to import that? I told you earlier as well how the Ministry of Defense has made a long list of items, given it to the armed forces, and told them that you can't import these, you have to buy them from companies that are making it in India. That's the idea of import substitution. Now, it's a noble idea. It makes sense. You should have import substitution. You should be self-reliant in as many aspects as possible, especially when it comes to defense, etc. You have to be self-reliant. But at the same time, you also have to make sure that your self-reliance does not come at the cost of your development. Meaning, it's a very tricky situation. If you can import something from China at a lower cost, do you still make it within your country even if it is much more expensive? The government under this has been trying to reduce foreign dependence, encourage indigenous industries, and it has been happening since independence. I'll give you a present example. The government of India at present runs something called the PLI scheme. PLI is Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Production Linked Incentive Scheme. The idea is, for example, let's say there's a mobile phone manufacturer that usually makes 10 lakh mobile phones in a year. Lump sum. The government says, okay, if you take it to 13 lakh or 14 lakh or 15 lakh, if you increase it to that amount, we will give you some incentive. So the government basically measures what your average production is and then gives you an individual target. And then promises you incentive in return for that. That's called a production linked incentive scheme. It started with only 3 sectors. As of now, the government has this scheme in 14 sectors, trying to encourage production in India. It includes many sectors such as mobile phones, drones, chip manufacturing, etc. The government wants all of that to be happening in India. Again, the idea indeed is import substitution, especially when it comes to critical technology for the country's development. You do not want to be dependent on any other country, especially countries such as China, which are not on good terms with us. This is what government has been trying to do for many, many, many years. We have been slightly successful, not 100%, but there have been certain achievements of import substitution. Again, reminding you, this chapter tells us about India's journey till 1990. I am individually taking the liberty of giving you some up-to-date data today, but mainly chapter is about what happened till 1990. So the achievements and everything that we will discuss here of import substitution are from the point of view of achievements till 1990. So this import substitution policy led to a lot of key industries being developed in India, not at par with the other countries in the world. For example, China produces steel at a much, much, much cheaper price than any country in the world. Today, every country is fed up of the cheap Chinese steel coming into other countries, being dumped into other countries. So we have been able to develop all these industries, although the price may not be that competitive. We also have been able to have diversified industrial base. Again, not at par with some of the most developed countries, but it's not that we have not done well. In terms of the production, in terms of contribution in the GDP of our industrial growth rate, if you see that also has been impressive in 1990. In 1950-51, 13% of our GDP was made up of industries. By the time period that we're talking about, till 1991 reforms were introduced, it became 24.6% of our GDP that came in from the industry sector. So yes, a lot more could have been achieved, a lot more, we had a lot more potential, but these were the aims and objectives that we were able to achieve in under our policy of import substitution. At the same time, it is not without its own criticism. Even today, around the world, this term protectionism is discussed very widely. Protectionism, in simple terms, is opposite of globalization. The simple idea is protecting your companies, protecting your own indigenous industry from any other country, from their competition. It's like a simple idea. You know, when India signs a free trade agreement with other countries, India is infamous as a country that prepares a very long negative list. Negative list means, for example, let's say India and Australia sign a free trade agreement. India would tell Australia that it is fine, but there are certain products that will not be a part of this agreement. Means there are certain products, let's say cheese. If Australia sends its cheese to India, we will still want to impose taxes on that. So cheese will be a part of negative list. Negative list means those list of products which are not covered under the free trade agreement, they will still be taxed. This is a negative list idea that allows or that is aimed at protectionism. You put higher taxes on products coming into your country so that you can protect your industry. India usually does it with the agriculture sector because we think that our agriculture sector is very important and it will not be able to sustain competition from other countries. The government also, under this and big criticism, was started permit license Raj, which was one of the very, I don't want to say worst thing, but one of the big reasons because of which our industry just could not flourish. For every little thing, you required licenses from the government. There was a time in the country where the government decided and they told the car companies how many cars can be produced in the country. Like the government gave a limit that in 1 year, you can only make 20,000 cars, not more than that. Imagine, companies are ready to make more than 20,000 cars. There are more than 20,000 people ready to buy that car. But the government says, no, you can only make 20,000 cars. We will decide how many cars will be running in the factory in 1 year. That was a license permit. Now, the problem is the more permissions that you impose here, the more restrictions that you impose here, not only does it discourage the businesses, it also allows a bureaucracy to come in between and enable corruption. This allows, for example, the officers to come in between and say, oh, you give me the money, then I'll give you the permission, I'll give you the license. If you don't agree to what I'm telling you, then my report will be negative about you and you will not get the license to do anything. These are problems that have been a part of or have been a result of the industrial policy that we have. Then lack of competition, which resulted in stagnation, poor productivity. India, and it's a very derogatory term, India was described as a country showcasing something called the Hindu rate of growth. What was Hindu rate of growth? Basically, 1970s, 1980s, all throughout that, India's growth rate used to be some 3% only. Now imagine India growing at 3% is very different from a country like America growing at 3%. But 3% means 3% of your last year base. When India had a base of, let's say, 1 lakh, America has a base of 1 crore. It's a very different matter. If you have a salary of 1 crore and you say I got a 3% increment, that means your salary got increased by 3 lakh. And if this guy says my salary got increased by 3%, that means he only got an increment of 3,000 rupees. So there's a huge difference. Percentage to percentage comparison is not fair unless you compare with the base. That is why India lagged a lot of this issue because of which our growth rate was stagnated around 3%. We just could not go beyond that because there was no incentive from or the government towards the private sector. If I run an industry, if I own an industry, why would I do something extra? Because I know that there's no point the government will take the money away from me. There was a point in time when Indira Gandhi government was in power that India's income tax rate was 97%. Can you imagine that? India had seen such times as well, where you will earn 100 rupees and you will only get to keep 3 rupees, government will take 97 rupees. Imagine such a situation. All that was the outcome of these kind of government policies that existed at that point of time. The industrial policy itself had much criticism. First big criticism, Excel licensing requirement, as I just told you, every single thing ran on licenses. To open up a very small establishment, you need a license, and then someone will come to your place, ask you for hundreds of documents, they will keep on coming in the name of inspection. And you had to make them happy because if they give one negative report, your entire establishment will come down. That became a problem. Then there was corruption in licensing. As I told you, the more restrictions you impose, the more requirement of paper that begins that you have to submit this document, that document, the more problematic it becomes. Because it gives a chance to the bureaucrats to come in and then earn money in return for that. There was also poor management of PSU, as I discussed earlier. Public sector enterprises, they were never run by experts. They were not run by people who knew how to run businesses. They were run by bureaucrats. They were run by people whose primary job was not about earning profit. For them, earning profit was never a concern because their salary, their increment was just not dependent or linked on the performance of these companies. And there was lack of innovation. Because again, innovation requires you to own that enterprise. Innovation will only be done when you really feel about it. When you have enough money, enough technology, enough investment. If you don't have any of these things, how would any innovation come? And this is where, as compared to private sector, the public sector in India took a back step and we just did not have enough investment. Now, from the modern day perspective, as if you compare that to today, where do we stand? We still have multiple ongoing reforms from the side of the government. Just to give you a few examples. There are multiple initiatives going on. The PLI example I gave you, Production Linked Incentive Scheme, Make in India, Startup India, all these have been initiated by the government to boost manufacturing and innovation. Whether they have been successful or not, it's still something of a question mark. There are environmental sustainability concerns that the government has. The government has been trying to push agriculture into a more sustainable method. For example, the government is trying to reduce the use of urea. The government is trying to push the farmers towards nano urea so that soil qualities is intact. Then the government is still trying to include as many people in the financial sector. This is called financial inclusion. A few years ago, when the government started PM Jan Dhan Yojana, where crores and crores of bank accounts were opened up, that was a revolutionary step. Where many people became a part of the banking system, which was not the case earlier. That allowed the government to also target the people when they wanted to transfer money to the people bank account. They had a way to do that. All of that was possible because of that. We have PM Kisan scheme. These are just a few examples. In the PM Kisan scheme, the government, for example, right now gives 6,000 rupees per year to small marginal farmers, 2,000 rupees 3 times in a year to those farmers who have a land holding of 2 hectares or less than 2 hectares. Then the government also has been focusing on the IT sector. IT's contribution to our GDP is well above 50% right now. Government's push towards services sector has paid rich dividends over the decades, and this has continued. This is just a present day perspective of where we stand as compared to where we were earlier. Just to conclude, 1990 till the time that the chapter takes us was a time period where India was growing gradually at a snail's pace, not at a very fast pace, but at least we were growing. After that comes 1991, the era that changed India forever. In the next chapter, we'll be talking about the 1991 LPG reforms in detail. What are LPG reforms? What was the need for it? And where did it take India in the future? This was the chapter number 2. Do join in and read about chapter number 3 of class 11 economics NCERT. My name is Harshmeet Singh. Thank you so much.